So today, as some of you may know, is the World Day Against the Death Penalty. And this year's theme is access to counsel. So basically, we're advocating for the right to effective legal representation for individuals who may face a death sentence. And we're going to be speaking to Professor Dr. Anup Surendranath about this. Dr. Surendranath teaches constitutional law at National University, Delhi, and he's also the director of their Center on the Death Penalty. Some of you may know it as Project 39A. The work done by Project 39A is phenomenal. They've conducted the first ever empirical research on the administration of the death penalty in India. And we would strongly urge everyone to visit their website and read the reports that they have published. So Dr. Surendranath, let me start off by saying that every time there's a gruesome rape in the country or an act of terrorism, the phrase capital punishment is bandied about. And honestly, in a case as horrible as Nirbhaya or 2611, it's easier to just hang the accused and believe that justice is done. But what do you think is the single most important reason that you are against the death penalty or you believe that it should be abolished?
Right. Thanks, Natasha and Sarah, for having me over today. And it's great work that you do with what you're doing on Instagram and your website. It really was fascinating to read through that. So in order to answer your question, Natasha, yes, just to get to the very heart of the question, and after peeling off all the other arguments, layer by layer, at the core of my opposition to the death penalty, and it's only my opposition, and I'm only going to state what I believe in, is the fact that crime is a social product, right? And let me just explain what I mean by that. When somebody commits a crime, there are multiple components to it. Of course, there is the individual aspect to it, but I think very often we mistake that fact to be that crimes are purely a matter of individual action and individual will, right? And I'm not denying that there is an individual will to it, and that is why there must be punishment. But I think we often choose to ignore the fact of society's contribution in creating crime, right? In creating people who commit certain actions, right? And even if you talk of sexual violence, and even the most gruesome case of sexual violence, it is important to understand how sexual violence is produced in society, right? It's not just a case of a few bad apples in our midst and us removing those bad apples, and suddenly, if you remove sufficient number of bad apples, society would all be hunky-dory again. There are certain social processes amongst us that we all contribute to, that we are all part of, that generates crime, that produces crime. And that is, as I again said, it is not to deny individual will. I'm not saying that we're all automatons, just going about doing things that society has determined for us. That's not my position. But my position is society cannot wash its hands off in terms of its own contribution to crime, in terms of creating people in society who commit certain actions, right? And in that situation where society must be honest enough to acknowledge its own contribution and its own role, I think it's a little unfair and hypocritical for society to say that we will take the life of that individual, right? Because that would convey that what society is trying to say is that the individual is solely responsible for what she or he did. And that's never the case, right? And for me, that's the core of my argument. I mean, I might attach a lot of things around that to why I oppose the death penalty. But if you strip away all those layers, and this is my core of my argument as to why you cannot have the death penalty.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. Society can't wash its hands off such things, and there are bound to be criminal elements, and we need to realize that we as a society have contributed to the formation of these elements. But But you know, when you hear of atrocities such as the Hathras rape or crimes as gruesome as Nirbhaya, wow, I mean, they literally shake our conscience, right? It's rarest of the rare. So why shouldn't the death penalty be awarded in cases like these?
No, I mean, it's you're absolutely right, Natasha, to say that when you hear about certain crimes, right? It's. I mean, we are all shocked, and we wouldn't be human beings if we weren't shocked by it. But my point is, who do we then look to blame for it, right? Who do we? I think it's very much our own discomfort with ourselves that we live in a society, that we contribute and have created a society where such things happen. I think it's a difficulty to come to terms with our own failing as a society, that we think that the response to it is to blame certain individuals. Do those individuals, are they blameworthy? Of course they are blameworthy, right? But to say that that a Hathras won't happen again, or a Delhi gang rape won't happen again, or the gruesome child rape and murders that we saw won't happen again, right? Or the case in Hyderabad that happened won't happen again. It is, I think we would be kidding ourselves to say that by harsh punishment or by the harshest punishment, these things are going to get solved. They are not going to get solved, right? We might have a much more honest conversation, Natasha, if we said that these things are not about deterrence, right? These things are not about preventing these crimes, because we know that by hanging a few people or killing a few others, we are not going to stop rape in society, right? Anybody who understands sexual violence in society knows that it is a far deeper social problem that exists in our midst, right? So in that sense, we might be far more honest having a conversation that this is in effect about social revenge, right? That's what this is about, right? That this is not about ensuring safety for women or ensuring that lesser crimes happen. I think a far more honest conversation is that we want revenge. But, and I think that can be a separate conversation. That's a very different conversation. Whether we should pursue the goal of revenge through the instrumentality of the law is a very, very different question. And we can have that conversation. But let's not pretend that we are seeking harsher and harsher punishments and the harshest punishment of the death penalty to protect future victims or to reduce crime. It's not about that. And I think we need to stop pretending that it is about that. Now you may ask, why can't we, why is revenge so bad, right? Why is revenge so bad, right? You might ask, why can't we pursue revenge through the instrumentality of the law, right? And that's important to think about, right? And very often I'm asked, given the kind of work that we do and the people that we represent or who are on death row, I'm asked, oh, what would you do if this were to happen to somebody in your family, right? Or if this were to happen to some child in your family, right? You are able to say all these things because you have never experienced, right? But my point is, yes, I might very well feel the need for revenge if something like of that sort happened to a member of my family. I might very well feel it, right? I'm not here proclaiming that people should be above those sentiments or those emotions, right? I think it would be entirely legitimate for people to respond in that manner. And I think it's completely okay, right? It's completely okay for any of us to feel that individual sense of wanting revenge, right? But there is a big qualitative difference between me feeling that and the state pursuing that, right? There is a huge difference between that individual response or individual need for revenge and the state pursuing that through the instrumentality of the law. I think that, and the reason for why I argue that is that the state is just as much responsible to the victim as it is to the offender, right? Both are failures of the state. That a crime happened, the state has failed the victim. That somebody committed a crime, the state has also failed that individual, right? Both are failures of the state. And the state, again, cannot choose sides in this sort of philosophical argument, right? In court, it does. It is prosecuting and it is seeking punishment. But I'm trying to address my argument that the state cannot pursue revenge. It is very different, and very often we see states now saying, "Oh, this is what the victim's family wants, so this is what we'll also push." No, that is a sleight of hand that is not available to the state, right? Right, and the state finds it very convenient, right, to hide its own failure by attempting to step into the shoes of the victim's family and saying, "Oh, we will pursue this revenge on your behalf," right? And the state cannot do that. I think it's not morally legitimate for the state to do that because it has failed the victim as much as it has failed the offender.
No, absolutely. So, but let me take you one step back here, because there is a common conception that the death penalty does deter crime. Because I mean, it's the death penalty, right? So,
Right.
But is that true? I mean, because most of us are non-lawyers here, so vis-a-vis life imprisonment, is the death penalty a deterrent?
Right. Now, the very honest answer to this, let's look at certain facts, right? India has not really done these deterrence studies, right? Right? There is no empirical way for me to conclusively answer that question based on evidence that we have seen. The Americans, on the other hand, have done quite a few of these deterrence studies, right? Since their decision on Furman and the sort of mid-70s, there has been this thing to look at this question that you're asking, right? So in the mid after 2010, they decided, and the National Academy of Sciences, which is the highest scientific body in the United States, decided to do a review of these deterrence studies, right? And saying, okay, what is the answer to this question? And they came to a very sensible conclusion, right? They said, these deterrence studies, there are some studies that show that it is not a deterrent. There are some studies that are inconclusive, right? There are some studies that show it might be a deterrent, right? And it's all over the place. And then they said, if this is the lay of the land, and I'm talking of the National Academy of Sciences, I'm not talking of some group that is advocating for the abolition of the death penalty or are activists or whatever. These are people who deal with statistics and that kind of experts who said that, if this is the lay of the land, and the only sensible conclusion we can come to is that the deterrence argument is far from certain, right? It is inconclusive, right? And because it is inconclusive, it is dangerous to rely on it as an argument to take somebody's life, right? It is given that we are unsure and there is so much doubt around it. And I think that's something we all can, as reasonable people, agree on, right? Even the most ardent supporter of the death penalty would, as a reasonable person, agree that this is uncertain, right? And given that it is uncertain, it is only fair and less dangerous to say that now let's try and take somebody's life on the basis of this, right? And another example is, if coming to our own country, right? The Andhra Pradesh and Telangana High Court, right, has not confirmed a single death sentence in the last 20 years, right? Um, right? But there you're not seeing crime rates shooting through the roof, right? Crime rates are much higher in states that do confirm the death penalty. But anyway, even if you say, oh, how can you prove it or whatever, I think the reasonable position to take is that the best case scenario for the deterrence is that it is an uncertain connection, right? And given that uncertainty, it's best not to use it as a decision to make policies or legislative choices.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So, thank you for giving us an overview. But I think because this year's theme is effective legal representation, what I would like to ask you is what is the role played by a lawyer at each stage of a case involving the death penalty? So, let's start off by collection of evidence.
Yeah, so, world over, where the death penalty does exist, it's the poorest of the poor that get it, right? And as a result of the fact, they are terribly represented and very often access good representation only at the very last stages, right? And therefore, in these cases, a lot of damage is done from the perspective of a fair trial, right? At the very early stages, right? It is when you're arrested, right, and when you're interrogated, right, and while the law says you have a right to access a lawyer, there is no fundamental right at the stage of police interrogation that a free lawyer has to be necessarily provided to you, right? That it would be an illegal. The position of the law is that the state does not have to necessarily provide a lawyer at that stage. Yes, legal aid schemes might entitle you, right? You can ask for a lawyer. There are legal aid schemes from the National Legal Service Authority and the State Legal Service Authority that says you can have a lawyer, but it is not like that the police, that entire interrogation would be deemed unconstitutional if you're not ensured a lawyer at that stage, right? And therefore, and most of these prisoners who are sentenced to death are so poor, are so vulnerable, right? The manner in which, and we did a study with 60 former judges of the Supreme Court and published it. It was incredible to see how many judges acknowledge, and these are former Supreme Court judges, who acknowledged that fabrication of evidence and torture is a very grim reality of our criminal justice system, right? So there is no denying that, right? There is no denying that, and the question is, why do the police torture, right? Why do the police torture? Why is and our position in our evidence law is that a confession to a police officer is inadmissible in a court of law, right? So if I say I murdered X to a police officer and they make me sign that sheet of paper, that is inadmissible in a court of law. That can't be used against me in a court of law. But why do they still torture you? Why do they still make you sign that blank sheet of paper, right? It is because there is another provision of the Evidence Act which says that while my statement that I killed X cannot be used against me in a court of law, if I say I killed X and I buried the knife with which I stabbed X behind behind the railway station, and the police then go and recover that knife, right? That my statement that the knife is behind the railway station can be used against me, right? So very often, what do the cops do? They get me to sign this statement. They torture me and get me to sign the statement, and a recovery is fabricated. A knife is placed there, right? And it is recovered, and then that statement is used against me, right? Now, if I have a lawyer, right? If I have a lawyer, I at that stage, and that's the most crucial stage at which you really need to have a lawyer, right? at the stage of police interrogation, right? And in our system, unfortunately, that's sorely lacking. The first time you get any access to a lawyer is when you're produced 24 hours after your arrest, at that first production, whether to decide whether you must be sent back to police custody or whether you must be sent to judicial custody, is when you first are entitled to a lawyer constitutionally, and the judge has to ensure you have a lawyer at what is known as a first production, right? But the damage is done, right? And you know, from that very first moment you are arrested, if you are not advised properly, if you're not given adequate legal advice, your case starts going downhill. And in so many of our cases that we litigate in the Supreme Court, right, it is tragic as to the kind of things that were allowed to happen at the stage of police investigation and the trial, and so many of the things that should have been done there were not done there, right? In terms of what kind of witnesses do you call, right? What cross-examination do you do? What questions do you put to experts, right? All of that doesn't end up happening. And I think particularly the death penalty, I want to speak about one example of a case that we did, and a case that came to us at the stage of a review petition in the Supreme Court, right? And what is a review petition? It means that the Supreme Court has already confirmed death sentence in that case, right? After the trial court and the High Court have confirmed the death sentence, it's only then that the case comes to the Supreme Court, and a review is after the Supreme Court has already confirmed the death sentence. And so we got involved as a review stage. And it was this case of a really poor person. And if you read that judgment, and one of the exercises that I do often with law students is that I make them read the judgment of the Supreme Court confirming his death sentence, right? And here was a person who was, and this might be difficult for some of you to hear, so I'll just preface with what I'll just tell you that before I go on to narrate the facts. It was a rape and murder of a 2-year-old girl, right? Where this person attempts to rape this girl, and when he figures that he's unable to rape her and she starts crying, he uses a boulder to smash her face and kill her, right? So the court is aghast at this, the kind of, and as will anybody be, right? And that's as if I narrate this to anybody, you're like, oh God, why are you even representing this person, right? Now, the point is, if you read the judgment, this person is made out to be this horrible person, all the kind of language that is used, that he's a demon and is not worthy of being a human being, right? And all of that, right? And I first make those law students read that part of the judgment, right? Without giving them any further information. And then I present to them parts of the mercy petition that we submitted, right? Based on over 60 hours of interviewing him and his family, right? And then they're shocked that the person that they saw in the judgment of the Supreme Court is very different from the person being presented in the mercy petition, right? It has, and it is, and these are just such extremely difficult cases, right? The law requires, irrespective of what society feels or what we might feel as the public, the law requires that when sentencing a person to death, after you found him guilty, when sentencing a person to death, you have to balance, you have to weigh aggravating factors and mitigating factors. You and I may or may not like that's what the law says, but that's what the law says, and that's what courts are supposed to do. That's what judges are supposed to do. You are supposed to look at aggravating factors and mitigating factors. Now, in this person's judgment across these 3 levels of courts, trial court, high court, and the Supreme Court, There was absolutely no mitigating information being presented about who this guy is. Who is this chap? If you read that judgment, those judgments of the three courts, you will think that the only thing that there is to this chap is that he is this horrible person, this terrible person who tried to rape a 2-year-old and murdered her, right? But what we found was such a long history of mental health concerns from as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult, that the kind of tantrics and babas and ashrams that he was sent to in trying to be cured, the kind of treatment that he was subjected to in those ashrams, right, by his own father, by his family, and the kind of life that he led is something that should have been before the trial court, right? And it was a job of the lawyer to dig all of this out, right? It would have been the job of the lawyer at that stage when he was being represented in the trial court to dig out all of this information and present it to the judge. Now, but since we are talking of extremely poor people, who even if they hire private lawyers, they are able to pay them such a pittance, right, that the lawyer is not going to invest that kind of time and effort and to go and dig up this kind of information and invest hours and hours and months in digging out this information, right?
Yeah.
And therefore you have a legal process in courts where the only information before the judges is the prosecution's version, right? Where, they're making this person to be the worst person possible. There is no one really to challenge the fabrication of the evidence, right? And I'm not here for a moment suggesting that everyone is innocent or a large section of people are innocent. That's not my argument, right? That's not the job of defense lawyers, right? The argument is not that, oh, these are all innocent people. The argument is that as in a criminal trial, the job is to ensure that the state has played according to the rules, right? That the evidence is gathered in the manner in which it's supposed to be gathered, that the criminal procedure code has been followed. And that is the job of a defense lawyer, to ensure that the state has met its burden, right? In that, when you don't have proper lawyers and lives of people are on the line, it really does great disservice to the people that you represent, right? And unfortunately, the people who get trapped into this are the people who have the least amount of resources, right? These are lawyers who never meet their clients or talk to them or talk to them about their case or understand the evidence or tell them, okay, look, this is the evidence against you. What do you have to say? Lawyers who represent the kind of people that we're talking about don't go and meet them, right? Because they're just not being paid enough. They are not just as interested in the case. And of course, there are exceptions to the rule. I want to just acknowledge that there are some lawyers at the trial court level and the high court who do an incredible job against the odds, right? And I'm not trying to make the case that everyone is a certain way, but I'm talking about what is a predominant experience, right? And as a result, you have people getting terrible representation at both the conviction stage and at the sentencing stage, right? And you have a whole bunch of people landing up on death row. And I would only say, to contrast this experience, when a head of a corporate company is threatened with a criminal action, or you have all these famous business people being arrested, to contrast the kind of quality of legal representation they get in trials, or your actors and actresses, the kind of representation they get, right? It's there for everyone to see how unfair the system is and how integral the lawyer that you have is to all of this entire process. I'm not saying that the lawyer is the only thing that matters, because there are a whole lot of other factors, but the lawyer is a very, very key part to deciding your fate. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you also mentioned that the people tend to hire private lawyers, or the quality of the lawyers improve at like the Supreme Court level as compared to when a person is being defended at the trial court stage. So, are there cases where there are wrongful convictions? So, like a person will be languishing in jail for like 15 years, and then his case comes before the Supreme Court, and then they like exonerate him of the crime, or they give him a much lower sentence. Are there cases like that, or
Yeah.
almost wrongful?
Yeah, absolutely. And the case of is the Akshardham case. 3 people were sentenced to death, right, by the trial court and the high court, right? And when it came to the Supreme Court, after 11 years of incarceration, they were acquitted, and the court made a very clear statement that these were people who were framed, right? That these were people who were framed, and these were people who spent 9 out of those 11 years on death row, right? And the kind of havoc that was wreaked on their families, right? And how it destroyed their lives, right? Are things we cannot imagine, right? I mean, it might seem, I mean, we use phrases like wrongful conviction and all of that, but just the human cost of that, right? Of living on death row for 9 years, not knowing whether you're going to live or die, right? Is another, and when these people came back to the Supreme Court based on the Supreme Court's own observation that they were framed, right? Asking for compensation. The then Chief Justice, denying it, said, we can't deny it, we can't allow this, because if we allow it, it will open the floodgates. That is a remarkable admission by a Chief Justice, to say that if we allow this, there are so many people waiting, right, who can come and make the same claim. What does it tell about our system? Another incredible case is of the Shindes from 2019. Again, it's from Maharashtra, right? After nearly 2 decades of incarceration, right? The court found that that they were framed, and the evidence was could not have even convicted them, right? So in terms of now you have to ask, what is a system where, now you can't say, oh, obviously the system works if they got off after 20 years, that we didn't execute them, right? Or we didn't execute them, or they got off after 11 years. That's easy for you and me to say and view it from that moral perspective and from the comfort of our homes, knowing very well that we will not be the people who are ever put in that situation, right? So if at all we are to be arrested, for anything, I mean, right? We can be pretty sure that we will get decent access to legal representation, right? But the people on death row are not people like you and me, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, just a question over here: does the right to legal representation? I mean, there is a right? Like you have a right to be represented, even if it's not by a private lawyer. If you don't have those resources, then by legal aid. So does that right include the right to quality legal representation? And the reason I'm asking you this is because I remember reading about Afzal Guru, and how he wasn't happy with his lawyer, and this was an extremely high profile case, not like a lot of death penalty cases which don't even come to the forefront. So if for example a person isn't happy with the lawyer, or they believe that the lawyer isn't providing them with the adequate defense, can you change your lawyer? Do you have the right to that quality legal representation?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the state of the law on quality legal representation, on what is insufficient quality, is rather poor, right? In that sense, the bar is quite low to meet the requirement of quality representation, right? I mean, we've come across cases where lawyers have been absent during cross-examination, right? Lawyers have been absent during sentencing hearings, right? Now, it has to be something very dramatic for the law to say that you have not received quality representation, right? And the burden is so high on the accused person to show why he or she thinks that he or she did not get quality legal representation. That is quite onerous, and very rarely does such an argument succeed, right? Because the bar is set so low as to what amounts to quality representation. And again, the point is there is no particular how do I say this? There is no tailoring of what does quality representation mean in a death penalty case.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very general discourse in the courts, and that discourse, the bar that it sets, it's quite low, and therefore it is an argument that rarely succeeds, right? But it is an area that does require, particularly on the death penalty, and given its close interaction with the quality of lawyering, it is something that we really need to think about long and hard, right? As to what does it mean to say that I had adequate representation in a death penalty case, right? Yeah.
So you mentioned that these legal aid lawyers, basically the lawyers who are given to you by the state free of cost, they're paid a pittance. So just to give our viewers an idea, how much is a legal aid lawyer paid?
Right. So now I just want to qualify that. I said the quality, from our study, what we found that quite counterintuitively, even though over 75% of them are economically vulnerable, nearly 65% of people sentenced to death in the trial courts at private lawyers. So despite being poor, they were hiring private lawyers because there is such a fear of the legal aid system, right? That the legal aid system, the lawyer will not do a good job, right? Or that the legal aid lawyer will be in collusion with the prosecution or the victim's family or whatever. So there is this great fear that whatever you do, you shouldn't take a legal aid lawyer. And therefore, these extremely poor people further drive themselves into debt to get a private lawyer. But even that debt that they take on, they are able to pay such a pittance, right? That either the private lawyer that they're able to get is not good, or even if they get somebody good, that person is not really invested in putting too much time into the case. So the quality of legal representation problem is not just a legal aid problem, right? It is an across the legal practice problem of what kind of representation do extremely poor and socially vulnerable people get in India's criminal justice system. And the truth is that irrespective of whether you get a trial court, a legal aid lawyer or a private lawyer, the quality of representation that death row prisoners have got is abysmal, right? Not everybody, not all death row prisoners get access to the kind of services that we provide or other lawyers provide, like Yog or Nithya Ramakrishnan or Rebecca John or whoever, right? It's not. There are some who are fortunate enough to get that kind of representation, but the quality of legal representation is a problem across the various levels of the court, of the legal system and the judicial system, and it is a function of what you can afford and what you cannot afford, right? So the problem is with the legal representation per se, and within that, I would say there is a great skepticism about legal aid lawyering amongst death row prisoners and amongst prison population per se. But I would think that the quality problem is much more widespread than just thinking about it in terms of legal aid. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I know that Mr. Chaudhary and Ms. John are exceptions, and but I mean, are senior, more experienced lawyers unwilling to defend people like, I mean, say Afzal Guru or Kasab? Is that the case? Is that why? Yeah.
You know, when we started our work to represent death row prisoners, right, out of Project 39A at NLU Delhi, one of my big worries was that who will appear, right? And you know, I am happy to report that the number of senior counsels that have agreed to appear in our cases pro bono has been exceptional, right? And it's something that has given me a lot of faith to continue doing, you know, for Project 39A to continue doing this work, and the kind of support that we've received from the Supreme Court, from the AORs, the advocate on record, the people who can file cases, and the senior counsels has been incredible, right? And even in Kasab's case, the court appointed Raju Ramchandran as the amicus, of course, among India's leading lawyers, Raju Ramchandran, right? So I think there is also, I mean, and also I think even in the Delhi gang rape case, the court did appoint to amici, right? Sanjay Hegde and Raju Ramchandran again, right? So it's, I mean, the question I would ask is a slightly different one. Are we ensuring consistent quality of representation in all death penalty cases? No, right? There is the big problem. The problem lies there that we are unable to ensure that every single death row prisoner that we go to great extent to ensure that that person gets only the best representation possible, right? There have been efforts at the level of the Supreme Court Legal Services Committee also to say that, you know, all death row prisoners must be represented by a senior counsel, but all of those, the performance on that is rather inconsistent and is a work in progress. But there is a long way to go to ensure that if we are interested in taking the life of a person, that we must be equally interested, right, in ensuring the highest standard, the gold standard of a fair trial, right? That the due process is of the highest standard. We are very far from ensuring that in the trial court, in the high court, and even in the Supreme Court, right? This enthusiasm that in the public that we see to say that, oh, we must take this person's life or this person must be hanged, we don't see a corresponding enthusiasm to ensure that due process rights and fair trial processes are followed, right? Our systems are just incapable of delivering that.
Yeah. There was just something that I wanted to say. Actually, I should have said it when you mentioned how very the prisoners are of legal aid. But I had read in one of Project 39A's reports that one of the prisoners resorted to begging in prison almost to hire a private lawyer.
Yeah.
But as you said that, I mean, obviously.
Prison is an entire different reality, and you know, how much ever one might read about it, and even when before I did the interviews for the Death Penalty India report, one is never ready for what one sees, what one hears, what one experiences in these spaces, and even then, I don't think one really understands even a fraction of what that experience is. You know, the little dynamics of people, you know, it's fascinating, right? Even among death row prisoners, I came across cases where some people would wash clothes of other death row prisoners to earn maybe like 5 rupees, right? Which 5 rupees to either buy toothpaste or soap or oil. It's it's heartbreaking. And
yeah, no, you're right. In fact, I think in the report itself, you all had mentioned the forms of torture that is often employed, and just reading some of it is unbelievable, because it's almost as if the crime that was committed is being repeated again in prison by the state, which is 10 times worse.
yeah,
But
and yeah, just hearing those accounts of people narrating what was done to them by the police and during investigation and in prison, and yeah, it's just, I mean, just, I guess for me, it just took so much strength and courage on their part to tell those stories to a stranger like me, right? To say what was done to them and the manner in which it was done to them. I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to open up to a stranger about it, right? Very often grappling with the difficulty of female researchers also there to take notes, right? Right? I can only imagine what, and yeah, it's, I mean, I don't think our experience of just hearing that and just how difficult it was for us. I mean, that our difficulty was, I think, no match. I mean, it amounted to nothing compared to what they were going through in reliving and narrating those experiences, right?
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It must be extremely traumatic. So, I mean, you mentioned that people who are executed, who are sentenced to death, belong to socially and economically vulnerable categories. But is there a difference between the profiles of those who are executed vis-a-vis that of persons whose sentence is commuted?
Right. I mean, that's. I mean, I think what has happened in India's death penalty is that there is an exaggerated use of the death sentence at the trial court stage, right? And our research shows, and that's in the report, for every 100 death sentences that the trial court gives, right? It's less than 5% that is confirmed by the Supreme Court, right? And a large number, about 40%, are acquitted between the High Court and the Supreme Court, right? Now that's shocking, and that as a system must shock us. That of every 100, 40 are acquitted, not just commuted from death sentence to life imprisonment. They are acquitted, said that these people should not even have been held guilty, let alone be sentenced to death. And we are talking of a system where these cases linger on for years and years before these high courts and the Supreme Court decides their cases, right? But the point on the socio-economic profile of India's death row prisoners is an interesting one. As we go, as the cases get filtered out in this 100 of every 100, 5%, the concentration of the socially and economically vulnerable keeps increasing, right? So if you think of it as a pyramid, the concentration of the socially and economically vulnerable is most concentrated at the top of the pyramid, right? Right. So that sense, in the sense, the system is in the end, who it is left with on death row are the most socially and economically vulnerable. Is a very revealing and tragic reality of our criminal justice system, right? Now, I mean, very often, I'm asked, oh, what is the death penalty problem in India? There is no death penalty problem in India because how many people have we executed in the last 20 years, right? I mean, and very people often want to ask that, right? And we might say, okay, 8 people have been executed in the last 20 years, right? So what's the problem, right? Look at America, look at China, look at Pakistan, right? Executing much, much higher numbers, right? So what are you crying about, right? I think what we must really cry about is just to see how long people spend on death row. And for me, the suffering of death row is not that moment of death, right? It's a profound misunderstanding of the death penalty to think that the problem with the death penalty is that moment when your life is taken, right? The suffering of the death penalty is that everydayness of it, not knowing whether you're going to live or die, right?
Yeah.
That is the true suffering of the death penalty. And that's where we must look at the question of cruelty and not at that, we can't reduce it to that one moment of when life is taken, right? And that's the mistake that we often make.
Yeah, and I think while, I mean, in the past 20 years, if there are eight people who have been executed, but there are so many people who have been sentenced to death every year.
Yeah.
So and
who languish on death row for so many years, right?
Yeah. So and the number of people sentenced to death every year in India is very large, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I think in 2018 we saw the largest number for the last 2 decades, right? On the back of the massive push for death penalty for sexual violence, right? Especially child rape, right? And I know child rape gets everyone upset, as it should, right? But again, there are certain realities of child rape in India, and when we've produced an animated video on the research and the realities and the connection between child rape and punishment on the Project 39A YouTube channel. Please go and see that. It was done with people who worked for the entire lifetime on issues of child sexual violence, right? We really should inform ourselves of many things before we take positions on such things, right? And when we show it to audiences who are, very often take the position that whatever else you say for child rape, death penalty has to be there, right? When they see that video, they're a little unsure. And I just tell you one part of it. One part of it is that nearly 95% of the offenders in child rape cases are known to the victim, right? They are within the family or family friends or neighbors, right? And therefore, when you introduce something like the death penalty into that, the consequence of that is that you are asking the child and the person taking care of the child to take the burden of sentencing somebody they know to death, to send them to the gallows. And what will happen, and what has been seen to happen, is not that there will be fewer rapes. What will happen is that fewer rapes will be reported, right? So when you say, yeah, you have to send if reporting to the police means risking sending your uncle to the gallows or your grandfather to the gallows, right? It is not so unthinkable that what you might choose to do then is not reported at all, right?
Yeah. Going back to your question about, the spectrum of quality, the spectrum of legal representation. Some people might have excellent lawyers, and some people might have lawyers who don't even meet them. But are there cases where a person, lawyers have refused to represent an accused? Has an accused ever had to represent himself in court?
Yeah, there are cases where accused have chosen to represent themselves, right? There are, of course, you see these terrible resolutions of local bar associations in so many cases, and that's an increasing phenomenon of local bar associations saying, oh, in such and such case, we will not represent. Nobody from this bar association will represent such and such person, right? And I think that is such a serious ethical violation as a lawyer. What does that mean? You are an officer of the court. It is your ethical obligation to ensure that a person gets represented. How can there be a local bar association resolution that we will not give representation, right? But thankfully, these instances where entire trials are carried out without representation, without a lawyer, are now more or less non-existent, right? I mean, they do keep popping up, but I think it's a problem that has been resolved to a large extent, right? I think judges do ensure that there's some sort of legal representation during the trial process, right? But very often there are times when there is this one person in the southern state, one of the southern states, who has a whole array of cases against him, right? And who has insisted, and including 2 death sentences, who has insisted that he himself will argue these cases, and has also had success in the High Court in commuting death sentences in other cases against him, right? And I think and his logic is, right, I am able to do a much better job of all of this than the lawyers who were appointed for me, right? And I don't know, how do you view that? Would he have been better served by having a better lawyer? I don't know, right? Would those 2 death sentences also not have happened if he had a good lawyer? But the number of cases he's been able to win in his favor, I mean, when I say favor, at least not have the death sentence imposed, is an interesting revelation, right? What does one say? When people are driven to that extent of a desperation to stand up and argue their own case, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether we're referring to the same case, but I remember reading about a case where the accused had learned investigative techniques from criminal investigative shows. So it was just crazy to hear.
And yes, from our clients, we have great demand for law books. Yeah.
Spoke about how the people who eventually do get executed, or the people at the top of the pyramid, right? They're more vulnerable socially and economically. And so do you think that's just because of the quality of legal representation, or do you think it has something to do with the judiciary as well?
Yeah, so no, absolutely. That's a good question, Sarah. In terms of, let's look at the cases that have resulted in executions, right? That have resulted in executions, the eight persons who were executed. If you look at the role of the public and the role of the media in those cases, the answer should be self-evident, right? Why did these 8 people get executed, right? And if you look at each of those cases and the history of those cases, right, and each of these persons, right, you will the answer will become apparent to you, right? So there's Dhananjay Chatterjee, there's Afzal Guru, there's Kasab, there's Yaqub Memon, and there are the 4 individuals in the Delhi gang rape, right? And the history of those cases speaks for itself, right? But unfortunately, Sarah, we are also living in a, and the point I'm trying to make without making it is that judicial processes are not immune to what happens outside court, right? I mean, very often we tend to ignore that. I don't think people inside court want to like talking about it, but the truth of the matter is that that strict separation that we seek to draw between what happens outside court and inside court sometimes collapses, right? And unfortunately, we live, and very often I'm asked, what is the biggest difficulty of the death penalty debate in India, right? And the biggest difficulty is very often that the death penalty is a 5-star problem, right? And why do I say that? Because we have always been in a situation where we are even struggling to combat the acceptance of extrajudicial killings, right? If you look at the Hyderabad, the reactions to the Hyderabad encounters, right? In what was done to the accused in the Hyderabad rape case, a kind of celebration there was after the four of them were killed by the police, right? It just shows you where we are as a society, what we find acceptable, what we find worthy of celebration, right? Our movies celebrate it, right? Our popular culture celebrates that kind of violence by the state, right? And in that context, to make a case against the death penalty, where things have gone through a trial, High Court, Supreme Court, review petition, mercy petition, it almost ends up seeming like, what are you guys even talking about, right? And when we are even struggling to make a case as to why the accused in that Hyderabad case should not have been killed in an encounter, right? That itself is a challenge. We are at that stage. We are fighting rule of law questions at that level, right? It only shows you the enormity of the challenge for the death penalty conversation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to link our viewers to an article you've written in the Hindu, which I think was just so fantastic, fantastically argued. But thank you so much, Anup. Fantastic, and I think all of us have just left this interview with much more knowledge about the death penalty, and hopefully we'll be a little more measured in our response in the future.
Yeah, if not anything else, to all of you watching, I mean, even if you're not convinced, or I mean, I'm not expecting you to become death penalty abolitionists overnight, but at least, as Natasha said, if you can be measured and think about it, just think about it with a little more depth, and and challenge our own assumptions and stereotypes. I think that would be a small step we can make towards making our society a little less violent.
Thank you so much.